Let's welcome Professor David Ryan.
Delighted. Ooh. I am delighted to be here from Boston today to talk to you about the future of cancer, and I can't thank Tencent and the organizers enough for inviting me. I'd like to start with a story. So it was about 30 years ago when I was finishing medical school, and I was on vacation with my family, and my mom got a phone call. And the phone call was, I could immediately see her face kind of drain of blood, get all white. And she found out that her older sister, Mary, had cancer that had metastasized from the breast to the bones. Vacation got cut short. We went back to New York, which is where I was from. And unfortunately, Mary had widespread metastatic breast cancer, and she wound up dying over the course of the next year. That was 30 years ago. So the first thing I want you to understand about cancer is that it's personal. And why is it personal? It's personal because everybody in this room is going to experience cancer either in themselves or in their loved ones. In fact, 1 out of 2 men, 1 out of 3 women. So you're not getting out of this life without experiencing cancer. So it's personal. It's really, really personal. Now, there's another reason why it's personal. What is it? So cancer really is a disease of genes, right? It's a disease of genes. If you accumulate enough mutations in the accelerator portion of your genome or in the breaking portion of your genome, you're going to get cancer. That cell's going to start to grow out of control, and you're going to get cancer. And it turns out that over a lifetime of living, there's a rate at which you will develop those mutations. And so cancer, for the most part, is a disease of aging. That's why the older we get, the higher the risk of us getting cancer. So is it a combination of bad luck that you got cancer? Or is it a combination of what the environment did to your genes or the genes that your mom and dad gave you? So let's walk through it. So we all have a rare cancer, all of us. And the reason for that is that we're born with a set of genes from our mom and from our dad. And the only other people in the world who are like us are identical twins. And since we all, of course, have identical twins, you're supposed to laugh. It's rare to have anybody who is genetically identical to us. And even the people who are genetically identical to us, they start interacting with the environment. And what the environment does to our genes changes it. And so that can cause mutations. And eventually, if you develop enough mutations in the accelerator portion or the breaking portion, you get cancer. So the take-home message for you is that when you get cancer, or your loved one gets cancer, it's unlike any other cancer anybody else has. Now, it can be kind of like it, but it's really uniquely individual to you. And that's why, as a doctor, when we sit in front of somebody, it's almost impossible for us to tell somebody exactly how they are going to do with their cancer. So what is the impact of chance on cancer incidence? Is it mostly bad luck, or is it mostly the environment? Now, I've been an oncologist now, so I finished medical school about 30 years ago, and then it took another 7 years of training before I could become a full-fledged oncologist. So I've been an oncologist now about 20 years. And this is the first question I get after I sit down and have to tell somebody they have cancer. Why did I get it? So it turns out that Bert Vogelstein and Thomas Eddy, 2 great molecular biologists down at Hopkins, set out to determine if that random chance that happens, that every time your cell divides, there's a rate given a particular tissue, there's a rate at which it will mutate. And if you acquire enough of those mutations, you get cancer. So is it mostly bad luck or not? It turns out the correlation is such that about 65% of cancer is just plain bad luck. Just plain bad luck. You can draw a line that goes right through that bad luck. Now, you can also determine the cancers on the left, which are really just about bad luck and how fast your stem cells are turning over, and thus how many mutations they're acquiring, versus those cancers that are due to either the genes you were born with, like let's say you inherited a BRCA mutation or familial adenomatous polyposis. Well, you're going to be starting really with a head start towards getting cancer. Or let's say you smoke or have hepatitis or have HPV. Or let's say in the modern world you're starting to get fat. So those are the things in the environment that increase the amount of mutations that we have in our cells and lead towards increased cancer rate. But the vast majority of it is still due to the just plain old bad luck. So why did I get this cancer? So when I sit in front of somebody, it's not that I discount smoking. Please don't smoke. It's not that I discount all the bad things we do to our body. Don't drink too much, don't eat too much. If you have hepatitis, get screened. If you have HPV, get screened. Because those things can lead to cancer. But most of the risk that you're going to experience in your life for most of the solid tumors and most of the lymphomas and leukemias are just due to this bad luck. So with that, we've been in this age of revolution. And there's 3 revolutions in cancer that are happening that I wish were available for my Aunt Mary. The first is targeted therapy. The second is immunotherapy. And the third is blood-based diagnostics. So if we all have a unique cancer, maybe there's a specific mutation that we can target with a specific drug. And that's called targeted therapy. And so instead of grouping people as having lung cancer or colon cancer or breast cancer, increasingly we're grouping people according to the kind of mutation that they have. So the first thing you need to know, right, is that cancer is personal. It's gonna hurt me emotionally, physically, mentally, but my cancer is different than other people's cancer. So I need to get molecular genetics to figure out how my cancer is different. And can I use targeted therapy, a drug that will attack a specific mutation that is driving that cancer through the cancer process? And in fact, you can. And this is what it looks like. This is ALK mutant lung cancer. ALK mutant lung cancer responds like gangbusters to ALK inhibitors. This was a study done by our own Alice Shaw of crizotinib in ALK mutant lung cancer. And this is what's called a waterfall plot. Dr. Zhu showed you a couple of waterfall plots earlier. On the far right-hand side, 100% of the tumor went away. That's another way of saying to someone, hey, pal, it's all gone. Your cancer's all gone. So we went from giving these people chemotherapy where maybe 20% of the time it shrunk a little bit, almost never did it go all away with chemotherapy, to handing somebody a pill and all the cancer went away. That was amazing. That was a huge breakthrough. And we started to see that in multiple different types of cancer. The problem, of course, is that resistance develops. So just like a bacterial infection that's chronically on antibiotics, that bacteria will figure out how to get resistant to that antibiotic. Similarly, multiple mechanisms of resistance developed to targeted therapies. And so for people, it became like this, a game of whack-a-mole, where you're just hitting that mole and it pops up in another. Or perhaps it became like this to the patient and the oncologist. They felt like they had multiple fingers in the dike. And eventually that cancer was going to blow through. And eventually, in fact, it does. Almost nobody has cancer that responds to targeted therapy forever. Usually, it responds for 1 to 2 years, and then resistance sets in, and then you're stuck with that cancer and going back to standard chemotherapy. And unfortunately, most people, if they have metastatic disease, wind up dying from that particular cancer. So the problem is that we've only got targets in about 20% of patients. In other words, we can't drug the other targets. Now, there are some big ones out there that we might hit in the next 5 years, but we're starting to feel like we're hitting our limits with targeted therapy. So we need something new. We need something different. And what's different could be something that is lasting, that has a memory, something like your immune system. And so these two guys, Dr. Allison and Dr. Hanjo, last year got the Nobel Prize for figuring out how your immune system turns itself off, not on, off, so that when you get the flu, you don't wind up in the ICU dying because your lungs whited out from an immune infiltrate, just keeping on going and going. What tells those cells, those immune cells, hey, everything's okay, turn yourself off? It turns out there are these checkpoint proteins, and these checkpoint proteins can be co-opted by a cancer cell to evade the immune system. So if the immune system sees your cancer as being foreign, which it can about 10 to 20% of the time, depending upon the cancer, some a little bit more, some a little bit less, that cancer, right, can have a T cell that comes after it, but it starts to express these checkpoint proteins, which we can now block with antibodies. The most famous were Keytruda and Opdivo, but there's been a whole host of these antibodies that have been developed now. And now you have people who are like this, Jimmy Carter saying, I'm cancer-free. He had metastatic melanoma that had gone to his brain, was one of the first folks on one of these antibody therapies against checkpoints, and lo and behold, his melanoma melted like butter. Well, it turns out that melanoma is a little unusual. You can see this in other cancer types, but again, it's about 20% of cancers will the immune system see as foreign. So we developed multiple of these drugs, but then the other thing that starts to happen is that you start to develop resistance. And resistance to these checkpoint inhibitors happens the same way that resistance happens to targeted therapy. Eventually, these cells mutate and figure out how to get around the T cell that's coming after it. Well, what if we could create something better? Because these checkpoint inhibitors also cause significant toxicity. In fact, they cause autoimmune disease. So when we unleash these antibodies that cover up the checkpoints, all of a sudden we see ulcerative colitis, we see thyroiditis, we see pneumonitis, we see some really bad toxicities. So how could we create a immunotherapy that avoided these toxicities and turned cold tumors hot? In other words, went directly after just the cancer cell and didn't have this unintended consequence of causing autoimmune disease. Well, some really smart people figured out CAR T cells, chimeric antigen receptor T cells, where we take your T cells out of your body, manipulate them to go after a specific protein that's expressed on the surface of the cancer, and then we infuse that back into somebody. Now that's worked incredibly well in lymphomas and leukemias. It's curing people. The problem is it doesn't work in all lymphomas and leukemias, and the initial studies in solid tumors are just getting underway, but we're already starting to see warning signs that solid tumors are a lot more complicated than lymphomas and leukemias, and this might be something that has a limit, but it's very hopeful. But we need something a little bit more hopeful, and I think the next 10 years is going to be about that. You know, it took 10 years after President Kennedy in 1960 said, I want a person on the moon, we got a person on the moon. Anybody have one of these? Smartphone? So when were these developed? About 15 years ago only. Now, who has a panic attack if they leave the house without one of these? Or who has a panic attack if you lose it? We all do. there is something coming that's going to transform the medical landscape, similarly to the way the iPhone transformed our whole lives. Because the iPhone did something that was actually not that technologically advanced when you think about it. We knew how to get on the internet. We knew how to make a phone call, right? And we knew how to do email. But they combined it all in one. And they gave us a camera. Well, what's coming down the pike are blood-based diagnostics. What if we could pick up cancer before it became stage 4, when it was only stage 1? And if we cut it out or radiated it, it had a 90% chance of being cured. What if we could do that? Well, that technology exists today. Cell-free DNA, circulating fragments of DNA that we can pick up in your bloodstream. Circulating tumor cells, the actual tumor cells, protein biomarkers, and also set your baseline by understanding your germline DNA, knowing what your mom and dad gave you. All of these things exist today, and the initial trials of looking at this in cancer patients are just getting underway. And the thing about them is that there's very few instances, very few, where we take a drug where most of the people are going to wind up dying and we help them live longer. There's very few instances where we actually cure them. But when we pick up a cancer when it's stage 1, and you can cure 80-90% of those folks because it's stage 1, that is better than almost any drug that we have in the solid tumor arena. And so circulating tumor DNA exists in our bloodstream. It gets shed by these cancers as soon as they have the ability to get into the bloodstream. And we can pick them up and we can measure them. We know we can do that now in people with metastatic disease, and we're just starting to see studies coming out showing us that we can do that in people with non-metastatic disease, meaning localized disease. We have the ability to collect circulating tumor cells technologically. This is like draining a river to get at the fish. This is a tour de force that uses microfluidics to get those circulating tumor cells. The things we can do with circulating tumor cells are absolutely amazing. We can culture those cells. We can stain those cells. We can fish those cells. We can get the RNA off those cells, and we can get the DNA off those cells. We can do all of that today. So what would I have wanted for my Aunt Mary? You know, she was in her early 50s. She had 4 kids, all who were on the verge of young adulthood when she passed away. What I would want is a blood-based diagnostic. I'd want a blood-based diagnostic just as her cancer incidence is starting to go up, maybe in her mid-40s, maybe in her early 40s, and I'd want her to get that test every year. And if she got that test, I'd want to pick it up at stage 1 and then have her be cured. So that's the future of cancer, and guess what? It's coming. Thank you.